Good morning. Regret that I can't be there in person, but I'm currently in Alabama enjoying sunshine and wonderful fried foods. But regardless, today I slotted to do the lesson brief for lesson 37, which is going to be the rise of Islamism. This lesson covered Westadt, pages 288 to 299, and then Booth's Invisible Armies from chapters 58 to 60. I want to pay particular emphasis to Westad's work because it pertains to the Iranian Revolution. I mean, although I might be personally biased, it is important to recognize that the Iranian Revolution provides the framework for the export of Islamism as a global force, especially within the Shia tradition. We can look at Afghanistan as being sort of the counterpart to that for the Sunni tradition. But I digress. So let's look at Westadt real quick. In his introduction, he posits his thesis, which is that while the 70s marked the high point of the Cold War confrontation in the Third World, it was also the decade in which the hegemonic presumptions of U.S. and Soviet ideologies began to be challenged. And they began to be challenged by political Islam. This is the whole point of the chapter. A lot of the background is going to delve into sort of historical points about Iran, and it's important to understand that because it provides a great framework for how we understand the Middle East in general and how it works. But again, the big point is to realize that this is where political Islam finds its footing. And it finds its footing in the Iranian Revolution. The revolutionary base would no longer be from the left after this time period, going into the 80s, but from the Holy Quran. And I say this even though the Soviet Union exists till 1991, from the period from 1980 till 1991, although the Soviet Union exists, you get glasnost and sort of a de-escalation in terms of communism being a threat to the United States' existence, but you get the rise of Islamism, and furthermore, you actually see attacks, you see deaths caused directly by Islamism on U.S. service personnel. It's not, this like conspiracy theory of the Soviets are going to attack us. It is actually, people who are Islamists who are blowing themselves up or who are carrying out acts of violence against United States targets, and I'll get into that during the course of this presentation. It's important to understand where Islamism arises. And it arises as a political ideology from the resistance to colonial domination in the Middle East from the beginning of the 20th century. So after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Treaty of Sèvres that places the fake boundaries that make up the modern Middle East today. And the reason why Islamism propagates, Islamism is targeted first and foremost not against the West, not against communism or whatever. It's targeted first and foremost against the collaborators. So when I say collaborators, I mean those indigenous people that decided to buy into either Western ideas of how to run a state, Western secular ideas of how to run a state, or communist ideas about how to run a state. They deviated from the path of God. They deviated from this idea of the caliphate, idea of one person, who can direct and represent the ummah. Now, the cornerstone of the belief system is justice, and this is where you kind of see parallels with that, Soviet ideology of social justice that we talked about in lesson 3, and that there is this need for a caliphate to get to God. And the reason for this need of a caliphate to get to God is because through that organization, through the unity of the ummah, the individual members are able to have that personal relationship with God, and that's because of the imposition of the Sharia. Sharia isn't just something that can be segregated into a solely religious aspect. It has to also come from a religious aspect it has to come from a lifestyle aspect as well. And so that's why you need a religious state according to an Islamist perspective. Now, this is not to say that this is what all Muslims believe. This is a specific strand, a specific thought that is held by a particular group who happen to follow the Islamic faith. Now, the reason why we start to see, Islamism on the rise in the 70s is because you have secular regimes that are under pressure from population increase, economic imbalances, and Israel's victory in 2 Middle Eastern wars. The Islamists thought that because of this, their time had come. The 2 big events, again, that are going to kind of be the hallmarks of this period are the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. We look at the Iranian Revolution and the Cold War, and basically you have to kind of understand where the grievances that the Islamists have, especially which are in Iran embodied in the clerical elite, the Shia clerical elite coming from Qom. It stems from a history of Iranian subjugation at the hands of the West. You have to remember that Iran has traditionally been an empire. I mean, since its pre-Islamic days from the Sasanians up through the Safavids, where Iran developed its Shia character, and then with the Qajar dynasty, Iran had always been pretty much independent and a powerful force within the Middle East. They dominated the Middle East at certain times, and from the Qajars forward, what you basically see is concessions being granted. So you see the first instance of collaborators. You see concessions being granted, particularly to Britain and Britain and Russia, mostly for oil and a big one, tobacco concessions that happened in the 1800s. And that's what the Islamists use as their first sort of citation that the monarchy has sold itself out to the West. In the 1950s, you see the rise of this figure in Iran. He's called Mohammad Mossadegh, and he comes to power. He comes to power on the basis of a nationalist sentiment that the Shah of Iran had sold out Iran to the United States now at this time, the United States and Russia, and that it was only through regaining Iranian rule for Iranians by Iranians that Iran would be able to kind of bring itself up. Mossadegh was not an elected leader. All right, that is something that needs to be stressed. He was not an elected leader. He was propagated. He basically had an internal coup within the parliament that made him rise to power. It's important to note that Mossadegh is a Qajar prince, and the Qajars were replaced by the Pahlavi dynasty, which is the current dynasty that we're talking about. We talk about the Iranian Revolution.
Have a great night.
That was taps. Anyways, so going along with that, the book talks about how the United States sponsored a coup, a counter coup to Mossadegh. It's called Operation Ajax. That coup is very much in its nascence. There was the popular support for the removal of Mossadegh and the emplacement of the Shah again. That was because of declining oil prices and the declining economy. That was a direct result of Mossadegh's nationalization of Iran's oil fields. I mean, nationalization is all good and well, but if you don't know how to even run the oil field in the first part, you probably shouldn't nationalize it. Now, the Shah of Iran kept oil flowing to the U.S. from the period 1954 till he was deposed. In return, the U.S. supplied the Shah with money and weapons. So the U.S. saw Iran as a bulwark against communism. He was very friendly to the United States. He was open to business. He was open to orienting himself towards the West. He wanted to base Iran off the United States. The goals of Mohammad Reza Shah are as follows. He saw the period when Iran was divided into economic zones of control. All right? He wanted to make Iran as a modern state, capable of rational government, economic growth, and military preparedness. And again, as I said earlier, his inspiration for the Shah was the U.S. Now, in getting to that point, after when he comes back to power in the 50s, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, he institutes what's called the White Revolution, or in Persian, Enqilab-i Safid. And basically, it's the most ambitious attempt at non-communist modernization in the Third World. It worked with the help of Western economists and social scientists. Now, here's the big thing. Even though you had Western economists and social scientists, it's all great and well, and it impacted urban areas, especially Tehran, Shiraz, and Tabriz really well. The problem with it is that a lot of Iran was still rural at this time, and these Western economists and social scientists knew nothing of the rural population of Iran. Even though in the urban areas you might have people who look Western and dress Western, once you go out into those rural areas where the base, that popular base is, religion plays a greater role. A huge role, especially because historically it was the ulama, the religious clerics, who controlled the education of the society. The White Revolution also stressed large-scale construction of heavy industry and power plants, emphasized the effectivization, is the term that Westadt uses, of Iran's export industries. This basically means the Shah wanted to ensure that Iran was in control of its own export industries, especially textiles. The importation of new technology, opening up a foreign investment. And that was all good and well, but the problem we run into is lots of social changes. And this is what really pisses off the mullahs, which is a nickname for clerics in Iran. This is what pisses them off. All right? One of the big things is the emancipation of women. It runs counter to the Shia doctrine that is espoused by the Twelver Shia strand that's big in Iran. Now, why is it a concern that you're starting to piss off the clerics? Well, the reason why it's a concern is twofold. And number one, as I told you, within the history of Iran, historically, the education, social services were carried out by the clerical mullahs. All right? And also, the clergy in Iran have always been involved in politics. They've always been a subset in politics. It's one of those constituencies that you have to grasp, all right? And that has been there since the time of Zoroastrianism, since before even the Islamic conquest occurred. I want to say it was Shapur II. He was a Sasanian emperor, in about right around the turn from BC to AD. And he basically said that without, religion, the state is nothing. So this is a holdover from Zoroastrianism where the religion and the state are paired. All right, this isn't some new thing within Iranian society. And that's something, again, that the West, especially the United States, fails to realize. And that's going to complicate matters when it attempts to sort of help with this white revolution. Now let's talk about Ayatollah Khomeini real quick. All right, so you should know something about Ayatollah Khomeini. He is the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was educated in Qom. He had a lot of influence in putting Mossadegh in power. He hated the Shah. Now, because of his training in Qom, which is the holy city for Shias, he had what's called ijtihad, which basically it's a concept in 12er Shia Islam, which says that the guy with ijtihad is able to talk to the 12th Imam. Now, the 12th Imam is an occultation. He's the Mahdi. He's supposed to be the Messiah that comes back and helps the Shia, gain world peace and domination, all this other stuff. But basically, he can talk with that 12th Imam, and that 12th Imam talks directly to God. All right? So, because of this, he is infallible in matters of religious jurisprudence. All right? In 1963, he is exiled for speaking out against the Shah. He felt that Iran needed to overthrow the Shah and replace it with an Islamic state ruled by Sharia and guided by clerics. He saw a secular state as sacrilege that necessitated holy war, jihad, in order to free Muslims who are under that yoke. He hated the hell out of the U.S. And he called the U.S. Shaitan Bozorg, which is Persian for the Great Satan, which you hear very often in Iranian news media. Now, as a side of that, during the 70s, as we talk about, so Ayatollah Khomeini gets, exiled and all that stuff, and the policy of the Shah and his white revolution and the tying with the United States grows. By the 70s, Iran was more of a U.S. ally than Israel. We had a freaking GM plant in Tehran. What's more American than that? Maybe there should be a McDonald's built next to it, and that would be the most U.S. thing ever. The Shah helps the U.S. combat Arab radicalism. And he also provides a bulwark because at this time, you have still that Arab socialism that's propagated by Nasser, and you have Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And Saddam was a Ba'athist, and the Ba'athists had a leftist socialist agenda. One of the ways that the Shah targeted Iraq was that he allowed Kurdish separatist forces in northern Iraq free passage and gave out arms like candy. Let's fast forward to 1976. The White Revolution gets in trouble. Oil sales did bring up the economy, but domestic spending had increased sevenfold. And so what you're going to get because of that is inflation going through the roof, foreign borrowing increasing, taxes increases. The result of these crappy economic policies was that the Shah state now became hated by pretty much everyone in Iran, spare a small group of Tehrani royal elite. And these Tehrani royal elite make up basically the majority of the diaspora movement that you see today. All those Iranian people in Los Angeles, they're usually there. They're usually that wealthy because of their economic ties to the Shah. And the wealth that they have still today is kind of like a highlight of the economic imbalance that was occurring in Iran. In 1977, the Shah takes the advice of Western economists and cuts domestic spending to help with inflation. This results in a recession. And one of the big problems that you see here is that a lot of young people, students, go unemployed. And when you have a lot of young students unemployed, bad things tend to happen. Let's see what those bad things are. So to pair with the domestic situation in Iran, Iran's staunchest ally, the United States, has an election. And Jimmy Carter who is the worst president ever, was elected. Now, he was elected right after the fall of Saigon, and this gives his administration emphasis on avoiding direct conflict in the third world. He was not good at foreign relations in Iran, foreign relations, period, end of story. I mean, even during this guy's election campaign, his staff was not allowed to travel because none of them had passports. I mean, this guy had no idea of the wider world. Carter's biggest mistake on Iran may have been his decision, this is what Westadt asserts, may have been his decision to pay the Shah a return visit in January of 1978. So you have the Shah of Iran, who's battling domestic turmoil because of the downward economy, and people are saying, Shah, you have sold out to the United States, you've sold out to the rest, you're not even a king of Iran anymore, you're just a puppet of the United States. And while he's trying to regain some sort of nationalist prestige, here comes freaking President of the United States, who shows up on his doorstep and says, oh, Shah, we're so grateful for your friendship, and blah, blah. What message does that send to the public of Iran? And it sends a very bad message. In January, you see the first violent protests since 1963 disturbances erupt. In September, a giant protest ensues, and this protest occurred because the Shah of Iran published a tabloid newspaper article basically insinuating that Ayatollah Khomeini was a pedophile. And in September, you see giant protests erupt, especially in the city of Yazd. It is violently put down. What this protest showed, though, even though it was put down, is that A, there is a unity of many elements of Iranian society against the Shah, and B, Khomeini had become a symbol of Iranian anger towards the Shah. Now, the U.S. is still, at this point, ignorant as hell about Iran. It saw the left, not the clerical mullahs, as the biggest threat to the Shah's reign. This is something that you need to know again. I'm going to influence this over and over again, is that clerical influence has always been a part of Iranian politics, even in pre-Islamic times. To discount that is to be ignorant of Middle Eastern history, especially Iranian history. Now, let's talk about the rise of Khomeini and the Islamic Republic. Talk about some more about Khomeini is that, he was booted out of Iraq by Saddam in 1978, and he never forgot about this slight. And this kind of explains sort of what's going to happen in the 80s when they go to war. He spread instructions to opposition forces in Iran from Paris. There's a 1978 broadcast from 60 Minutes, and they interview Ayatollah Khomeini from Paris, and it's actually very interesting. I highly suggest you take a look at it if you have the time, and if your weekends are as boring as mine. He built a wide base of support among all strata of Iranian society, spare the monarchs. And this is huge. Even though Ayatollah Khomeini hated secularists, hated communists, he still realized that he had to build a broad political base in order to achieve his aims. It's critical. That's one of the reasons why he is able to become a symbol of the revolution. And he's able to, once you're a symbol, you gain the populist support, then you can start taking out other facets of the revolution. And that's how he's going to be able to consolidate the Islamic Republic under his own sort of grip and make it a truly an Islamic Republic. So, going on. The Shah's government finally collapses in December of 1978. There's a 1 million-man march in Tehran. Now, this is held during the period of Ashura, and this is huge. And I'm a big believer that it's important to understand sort of the cultural background, because that's something that we overlook when we deal with third world intervention. We did in Vietnam. We didn't understand what the implications were for Vietnamese culture. The Soviets did in Ethiopia. So, as future leaders, maybe we should take a step and analyze the cultural history of these regions that we want to be involved in. So anyway, Million-Man March, December 1978, held during Ashura. Ashura is a holiday in the Shia tradition, and basically it marks the death of Imam Hussein, who was killed in Karbala at the hands of the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah. All right, and what that basically shows, it labels Shias as the victims of oppression. And so by having this march during Ashura, you sort of overlay that cultural Shia history with the current struggle that the clerics were trying to engage with the Shah in. At first, so after the fall of the Shah's government in December 1978, a guy by the name of Shahpur Bakhtiar takes power, and he was a secular nationalist, but he was forced to give all power to Khomeini because Khomeini was the symbol. And when he returns triumphant to Tehran on February the 1st, the people chant his name, and they call him Imam, which is huge. It connotates that he's a descendant of the Prophet and further strengthens his claim to ijtihad, which I talked about earlier. The Iranian Revolution signified a shift in third world opposition to superpower domination. This is something that you absolutely have to be cognizant of. The left had been the main force in confronting the U.S. since World War II, but Khomeini and an Islamic Republic visualized the existence of an alternative focus of opposition. In his view, the temporal justice derived from the world of God was the way to go, and not the conception of justice derived from the decisions of men. And another huge point that you need to understand about the Islamic Republic is that although it is warped, Iran still believed in modernization, which is why, to this day, it is the most advanced country in the Middle East, par none. It is a diversification of the economy. You see the Saudis right now having a problem because oil is in the dump, and their whole economy is based on oil. In Iran, they've had to learn how to make their own technology, their own parts. They've become an exporter of construction, of industry, of infrastructure, of technology throughout the Central Asian republics. I mean, they're involved, and also in their military industries too. Like they have even though they still rely on a huge stockpile of U.S. arms, which we gave to them during the Shah time, they've been able to develop their own missile technology, their own naval technology, and it does pose a serious threat to our interests. It's also important to know that Ayatollah Khomeini, even though the U.S. was his biggest, sort of focal point of hatred, he still hated the Soviets a lot. His revolution was to create Iranian rule for and by Iran under the confines of Islam, not under Western capitalism, not under communism. Period. End of story. Now, the U.S. under Carter still thought it could make peace with the Islamists after the rise of the Islamic Republic, but that sort of ended when the hostage crisis ensued and Khomeini supported the taking of U.S. hostages from the American embassy. The failed military rescue of hostages didn't help things much either, and then Iran strikes back with the creation of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the bombing of Marine Corps barracks in Beirut. Now, the Soviet view of the revolution is kind of mirrored upon the Americans. The USSR had always seen Iran as ripe for a communist revolution. It was sadly disappointed when Khomeini filled a lot of ditches and mass graves with leftists. Again, Khomeini was not a secularist, and he was not a fan of any foreign influence on Iran. The only influence on Iran was Islamic influence on Iran. All right? I guess the one kind of high point for the Soviets is that they avoided being the sole, they avoided being the great Satan. They were referred to as the Shaitan Buzorgi Digar, which in Persian means the other great Satan. So that's nice. At least they're the other great Satan. They're not the primary great Satan. So good job, communists. To wrap up, I'm going to talk about the significance of the Iranian Revolution. And it's a watershed for both superpowers, the USSR and the US, in their encounters with the third world. For the U.S., it meant that communism was no longer the comprehensive modern ideology that confronted American power. It showed the dangers of intervention in Muslim countries. For the Soviets, Khomeini's victory meant that the Marxist theory of third world revolutions had encountered significant problems. The left was supposed to supplant clerical reaction, as Westadt asserts, as the alternative to imperialist exploitation, not the other way around. Pronounced Islamic internationalism of the Ayatollah's revolution spread apprehension in Moscow, since it was a direct challenge to the rise of leftist, nationalist, and anti-imperialist movements throughout the region and the Third World. Ayatollah Khomeini specifically said that his Islamic revolution was not contained to Iran, but was contained to the entire Muslim world. All right? The founding of the Islamic Republic represents the third player, like the codification of the third player to international-leaning ideas of how to run states. They're the exporters of political Islam, first and foremost, especially with the Shia tradition. Still, and this kind of highlights the Soviet ignorance of the situation. They still felt that Islamists were in bed with Americans because of their shared hatred of anti-communism. They didn't recognize that, excuse me, they didn't recognize that Islamism in its own right was diametrically opposed to both. All right, so I'm going to briefly cover Booth's writings in the next installment of this video series. All right, so part 2 will be loaded up by your instructor. Thank you, Major Romanowski, in advance.